The morning mist clung to the magnolia trees like whispered secrets, and somewhere in the distance, the overseer's bell rang with its familiar harsh tone that marked another day of labor at Spring Plantation. The year was 1854, and the Mississippi heat was already promising to be merciless, even before the sun had fully risen above the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In the grand house that stood like a white monument to wealth and power, Flora Mary Whitmore paced the polished floors of her sitting room with growing irritation. As the plantation mistress, she prided herself on maintaining absolute control over every aspect of her domain, from the smallest detail in her household to the lives of the hundreds of enslaved people who worked her family's land. Her attention had been drawn to Evelyn, a young woman who worked in the house and whose elaborate braided hairstyle had somehow escaped Flora Mary's notice until now. The intricate patterns woven into Evelyn's hair were far too beautiful, too dignified for someone in her position, and Flora Mary felt a familiar surge of resentment at what she perceived as defiance. "Bring Evelyn to me immediately," Flora Mary commanded her house servant, her voice carrying the sharp edge that everyone on the plantation had learned to fear. Meanwhile, in the quarters behind the main house, Evelyn was carefully arranging fresh linens in the guest rooms, her movements graceful despite the weight of exhaustion that seemed permanently etched into her shoulders. At 22, she had spent her entire life at Spring Plantation, born into bondage and raised under the watchful eyes of overseers and masters who saw her only as property. But Evelyn carried within herself something that no amount of cruelty could extinguish, a fierce intelligence and an unbreakable spirit that manifested in small acts of resistance. Her braided hair was one such act, a way of honoring the traditions her grandmother had whispered to her in the darkness of their shared cabin, stories of a homeland across the ocean where their people had once been free. When the summons came, Evelyn felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. She had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded Flora Mary's fits of rage, and today the air itself seemed charged with impending storm. The walk to the main house felt longer than usual, each step taking her closer to whatever punishment awaited. Other enslaved people she passed along the way offered silent glances of sympathy and concern, their eyes speaking the words they dared not voice aloud. Flora Mary was waiting in the sitting room, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast harsh shadows across her face, making her appear even more severe than usual. "Your hair," Flora Mary began without preamble, her voice cold and measured, "is entirely inappropriate for someone in your position. You seem to have forgotten your place, Evelyn." Evelyn kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I apologize if I have displeased you, Miss Flora Mary." "Displeased?" Flora Mary's voice rose slightly. "You parade around my house with your hair arranged like some sort of African queen, as if you have any right to such vanity. This ends today." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Evelyn's braids represented more than just a hairstyle. They were a connection to her heritage, a small piece of identity that she had managed to preserve in a world determined to strip away every trace of her humanity. "Sarah," Flora Mary called sharply to another house servant, "bring me the shears from the kitchen, large ones." The next few minutes passed in a blur of humiliation and loss. Evelyn was forced to sit perfectly still, as Flora Mary herself took the heavy scissors and began cutting away the intricate braids that had taken hours to create. Each snip felt like a small death, another piece of her soul being carved away. But as the braids fell to the floor around Evelyn's feet, something unexpected happened. Hidden within the tight weave of one particular section, something small and metallic caught the morning light and clattered onto the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire room. Flora Mary froze, the scissors still raised in her hand, as both women stared at the object that had been concealed so carefully within Evelyn's hair. It was a small brass key, old and worn, with intricate markings that spoke of careful craftsmanship and significant age. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither woman fully understood yet. Flora Mary's face had gone pale, her earlier anger replaced by a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. "What is this?" she whispered, bending down to pick up the key with trembling fingers. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that her most carefully guarded secret had been discovered. The key had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family, hidden and protected through decades of bondage and suffering. Her grandmother had sewn it into the very braids that Flora Mary had just destroyed, and now it lay exposed in the hands of the one person who could never be allowed to discover its true significance. The brass key felt unnaturally heavy in Flora Mary's palm as she turned it over, examining the strange markings etched into its surface. The symbols were unlike anything she had seen before, certainly not the work of any local blacksmith or craftsman. They appeared to be letters or characters from some foreign script, worn smooth by years of handling, but still clearly visible. "I asked you a question, Evelyn," Flora Mary said, her voice dangerously quiet. "What is this key, and why was it hidden in your hair?" Evelyn's mind raced as she searched for an explanation that might satisfy her mistress without revealing the truth. The key was more than just a family heirloom. It was the key to a freedom that Flora Mary could never understand or allow. "I don't know, Miss Flora Mary," Evelyn said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "It belonged to my grandmother. She passed away when I was young, and I kept it to remember her by." Flora Mary's eyes narrowed as she studied Evelyn's face, searching for any sign of deception. "Your grandmother was born on this plantation just as you were. Where would she have gotten such a thing?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Evelyn knew that any answer she gave would only lead to more dangerous questions, but silence would be interpreted as defiance, and defiance always brought swift and brutal punishment. "She never told me, Miss Flora Mary. I only know that she said it was important, that I should keep it safe." Flora Mary stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the front grounds of the plantation. In the distance, she could see her husband, Jedediah Fitzgerald, returning from his morning ride, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they approached the house. Jedediah was a man of practical concerns, focused primarily on the profitable operation of their cotton fields and the management of their considerable workforce. But Flora Mary knew that he would be intensely interested in this mysterious key, particularly if it represented some sort of threat to their authority or security. "Jedediah needs to see this," Flora Mary murmured, more to herself than to Evelyn. "He'll know what to make of it." As if summoned by her words, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the hallway, and moments later Jedediah appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man with weathered hands and sharp eyes that missed very little of what happened on his property. "Flora Mary," he said, removing his hat and setting it on a nearby table. "I saw you through the window. What's all this commotion about?" Flora Mary held up the key, watching as her husband's expression shifted from mild curiosity to intense focus. "I found this hidden in Evelyn's hair. Look at these markings, Jedediah. Have you ever seen anything like them?" Jedediah took the key and examined it closely, his brow furrowing as he traced the strange symbols with his finger. "These aren't English letters," he said slowly. "They look almost like Arabic, perhaps, or some other foreign script." The implications of this observation sent a chill through the room. Foreign influence among the enslaved population was one of the plantation owners' greatest fears, particularly anything that might be connected to abolitionists or underground networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. "Where did you get this, girl?" Jedediah's voice carried a threat that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "She claims it belonged to her grandmother," Flora Mary said before Evelyn could respond, "but that's impossible. Her grandmother lived her entire life on this plantation." Jedediah's eyes remained fixed on Evelyn as he considered this information. "Unless," he said slowly, "her grandmother wasn't born here after all. Unless there are things about our property and our people that we don't know." The suggestion that there might be secrets hidden within their own household was deeply disturbing to both Flora Mary and Jedediah. They had built their wealth and status on the assumption of complete control, and the idea that their enslaved workers might possess knowledge or connections that they were unaware of threatened the very foundation of their authority. "I want you to search her quarters," Jedediah instructed his wife. "Search them thoroughly. If there's one secret, there may be others." As Flora Mary nodded in agreement, Evelyn felt a growing sense of panic. Her small cabin contained other items that had been passed down through her family, things that would be even more dangerous if discovered. Most importantly, there were letters hidden beneath a loose floorboard, letters that had been smuggled to her over the years by sympathetic travelers and abolitionists. These letters contained information about safe houses and escape routes, part of a network that helped enslaved people find their way to freedom in the North. Evelyn had memorized every word of those letters, and she had been planning her own escape for months, waiting for the right opportunity to use the knowledge they contained. "Take her to the quarters and keep her there while I conduct the search," Flora Mary ordered one of the other house servants. "I don't want her out of sight until we know what else she might be hiding." As Evelyn was led away, she caught a glimpse of Jedediah still examining the key, his face grave with concentration. She knew that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for her, but potentially for everyone on the plantation who had been quietly supporting the underground network that the key represented. The brass key was more than just a family heirloom. It was the key to a safe house located 50 miles north of the plantation, a place where escaped slaves could find food, shelter, and guidance on their journey to freedom. Evelyn's grandmother had been part of this network for decades, using her position as a trusted house servant to pass along information and assistance to those brave enough to attempt escape. Now that secret was in the hands of the very people who would stop at nothing to destroy it. The search of Evelyn's quarters was thorough and devastating. Flora Mary tore through the small cabin like a woman possessed, overturning the simple furniture and examining every crack in the walls and floorboards. When she discovered the loose board beneath Evelyn's sleeping pallet, her heart raced with the thrill of vindication. The letters hidden beneath were worse than anything she could have imagined. Written in careful script, they contained detailed information about escape routes, safe houses, and a network of sympathetic individuals who helped enslaved people reach freedom in the North. Some of the letters bore names that Flora Mary recognized, prominent citizens from nearby towns who had always presented themselves as respectable members of society. Among the correspondence was a detailed map showing a route that stretched from Mississippi through Tennessee and Kentucky, with marked locations indicating safe houses, sympathetic churches, and even specific individuals who could be trusted to provide assistance. The sophistication of the network was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications for the plantation system that formed the backbone of their society. "Jedediah!" she called, her voice shrill with excitement and rage. "Come quickly! You need to see this!" When Jedediah arrived and read through the letters, his face grew dark with fury. The implications were staggering. Not only had they been harboring a spy within their own household, but the network described in these documents threatened the entire economic foundation of their way of life. One letter in particular caught his attention, written in a feminine hand and signed only with the initial M. It described recent successful escapes from plantations throughout the region and provided updates on the safe passage of individuals who had been helped to freedom. The letter mentioned Evelyn by name, praising her courage and describing her as one of our most valuable allies in the cause of liberation. "How many others know about this?" he demanded, waving the letters in the air. "How many of our people are involved in this conspiracy?" Flora Mary's mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities for punishment and retribution. "We need to question everyone," she said, starting with the other house servants. Someone else must have known what she was doing. The couple spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting interrogations, calling each house servant individually to the main parlor and subjecting them to intense questioning. The atmosphere of fear that settled over the plantation was palpable, as word spread through the quarters that the masters had discovered something significant and were seeking to root out any additional conspirators. But even as they planned their investigation, both Flora Mary and Jedediah understood that they were facing a problem much larger than one rebellious slave. The network described in the letters was sophisticated and well-organized, with connections that reached far beyond the boundaries of their plantation. Some of the correspondence indicated that sympathetic individuals in Jackson, and even as far away as Natchez, were involved in the operation. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her cabin under guard, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her discovery would likely mean death, not just for herself but for others who had been quietly supporting the cause of freedom. The network that had taken decades to build could be destroyed in a matter of days if Flora Mary and Jedediah chose to share their information with other plantation owners and local authorities. As the afternoon wore on, word of the discovery began to spread through the quarters in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. The enslaved community at Spring Plantation had developed their own methods of communication, and news traveled quickly despite the constant surveillance of overseers and house servants loyal to the masters. Among those who heard the news was Samuel, a field hand who had been planning his own escape for months. He had been waiting for word from Evelyn about the best time to attempt the journey, and now he realized that his opportunity might be slipping away forever. Samuel was a man of remarkable intelligence and determination, despite having been denied any formal education. He had taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers and had memorized every detail of the escape routes that Evelyn had shared with him during their carefully concealed conversations. Also learning of the situation was Martha, an elderly woman who worked in the plantation kitchen and had been secretly preparing extra food supplies for potential escapees. Her own daughter had successfully escaped to freedom 3 years earlier with Evelyn's help, and Martha had dedicated herself to ensuring that others would have the same opportunity. The network within the plantation was more extensive than Flora Mary and Jedediah realized. It included not only field hands and house servants, but also skilled craftsmen who had been secretly creating tools and supplies that could aid in escape attempts. There was even a blacksmith named Joshua, who had been forging false papers and creating hidden compartments in wagons that passed through the area. That evening, as darkness settled over the plantation, Samuel made a decision that would change the course of events for everyone involved. Rather than wait to see what punishments Flora Mary and Jedediah might devise, he decided to take action. Using the network of contacts that Evelyn had carefully cultivated over the years, Samuel sent word to sympathetic individuals in the surrounding area, warning them that their operations had been compromised. The message traveled from person to person through a chain of trusted allies, reaching abolitionists and free blacks who had been working to support the Underground Railroad. The message was carried by a young man named Thomas, a free black who worked as a traveling preacher and used his legitimate reasons for movement to serve as a courier for the network. Thomas had been born free in Pennsylvania, but had dedicated his life to helping others achieve the same status. He understood the risks involved, but also recognized the urgency of the situation. The response was swift and coordinated. Rather than abandon the network entirely, these brave individuals decided to accelerate their timeline and attempt a mass rescue operation. If Evelyn and others were going to face punishment for their involvement in the Freedom Network, then at least some good could come from their sacrifice. The plan that emerged was audacious in its scope and timing. On the night of the new moon, when darkness would provide the best cover, a group of armed abolitionists would approach Spring Plantation and attempt to liberate not just Evelyn, but as many enslaved people as possible. The brass key that had started this entire chain of events would finally serve its intended purpose, opening the door to the safe house that represented the first step on a journey to freedom that many had only dared to dream about. But Flora Mary and Jedediah were not idle during this time. They had sent word to neighboring plantations and to the local authorities, describing the network they had discovered and requesting assistance in rooting out any other conspirators. Rewards were offered for information leading to the capture of anyone involved in helping enslaved people escape. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the courage and determination of everyone involved. On one side stood the forces of oppression, determined to maintain their control through violence and intimidation. On the other side stood those who believed that freedom was a right that belonged to all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. As the night of the new moon approached, both sides prepared for what they knew would be a decisive moment in the ongoing struggle between bondage and liberty. The night arrived with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Clouds had gathered to obscure even the faintest starlight, creating the perfect conditions for the rescue operation that had been planned with meticulous care over the preceding days. The air was thick with humidity and tension, as if the very atmosphere understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Evelyn sat in her cabin, still under guard but acutely aware of the subtle changes in the atmosphere around the plantation. The usual sounds of the night seemed muted, and she could sense a tension among the other enslaved people that suggested something significant was about to happen. Her guard, a young man named Peter, who had always shown her small kindnesses, seemed unusually nervous, constantly shifting his position and glancing toward the windows. At the main house, Flora Mary and Jedediah had increased their security measures, posting additional guards and ensuring that all the house servants were accounted for throughout the night. They suspected that the discovery of the letters might prompt some sort of retaliation or rescue attempt, and they were determined to be prepared. Jedediah had even sent for reinforcements from neighboring plantations, and armed men now patrolled the grounds with loaded weapons and trained hunting dogs. The couple had spent the evening reviewing the captured correspondence, trying to identify all the individuals mentioned in the letters, and planning their strategy for exposing the entire network. Flora Mary had already written letters to prominent families throughout the region, warning them about the conspiracy and urging them to search their own properties for signs of similar activities. But their preparations, thorough as they were, could not account for the level of organization and commitment that drove their opponents. The abolitionists who approached Spring Plantation that night moved with the precision of a military operation, using their knowledge of the terrain and the layout of the buildings to avoid detection. The rescue team was led by a man named Captain William Morrison, a former army officer, who had become convinced that slavery was a moral abomination that needed to be destroyed. Morrison had organized similar operations throughout the South, and his reputation among both abolitionists and slave hunters was legendary. He was accompanied by 6 other men, including 2 who had themselves escaped from bondage and now dedicated their lives to helping others achieve freedom. The rescue began at midnight, when a small group of armed men approached Evelyn's cabin from the direction of the cotton fields. They moved silently through the darkness, communicating through hand signals and taking advantage of every shadow and blind spot in the guards' patrol routes. Morrison had spent days studying the plantation's layout and guard rotations, identifying the weaknesses in their security that could be exploited. Samuel, who had been waiting for this moment, created a diversion by setting fire to a storage shed on the far side of the plantation. The flames quickly spread to nearby structures, creating a spectacular blaze that drew the attention of every guard on the property. As the guards rushed to respond to the flames and organize bucket brigades to prevent the fire from spreading to more valuable buildings, the rescue team reached Evelyn's cabin and quickly overpowered the single guard who had been left to watch her. Peter, the young guard, offered no resistance when confronted by the armed rescuers. In fact, he had been secretly hoping for exactly this outcome. Having grown increasingly uncomfortable with his role in maintaining the system of bondage that surrounded him, his cooperation allowed the rescue team to proceed without violence or noise that might alert other guards. "Are you Evelyn?" whispered Morrison, his face hidden in the shadows but his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Yes," she replied, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope that threatened to overwhelm her. "Your grandmother sent us," he said, using the code phrase that had been established years earlier. "It's time to go home." The brass key, which Flora Mary had kept locked in her jewelry box, had been retrieved earlier that evening by Martha, the kitchen worker, who had been secretly working with the network all along. Martha had used her access to the main house to steal the key during the confusion of the evening meal preparations, replacing it with a similar-looking but worthless piece of metal that would not be noticed until it was too late. Now the key would finally serve its true purpose, opening the door to the safe house that represented the first step on Evelyn's journey to freedom. But first, there was the matter of the other enslaved people who had been waiting for this opportunity. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn made a decision that surprised even herself. "Wait," she said. "There are others who want to come, others who have been waiting for this chance." Morrison nodded grimly. "How many?" 12, maybe 15, they're ready." The rescue leader had anticipated this possibility and had brought additional supplies and transportation to accommodate a larger group. However, he also understood that evacuating so many people would significantly increase the risks involved and require perfect coordination to succeed. What followed was a carefully orchestrated evacuation that tested the limits of everyone's courage and skill. Moving through the darkness in small groups, the escaped slaves made their way to a predetermined meeting point near the edge of the plantation, where wagons waited to transport them to the first safe house. Each group was led by one of Morrison's men, who had memorized the safest routes through the plantation grounds and knew how to avoid the remaining guards who were still fighting the fire. Among those who chose to escape were Samuel, Martha, Joshua the blacksmith, and a young woman named Rebecca, who had recently given birth and refused to allow her child to grow up in bondage. Each person carried only the most essential possessions, understanding that their former lives were ending forever and that everything they had known would soon be left behind. The evacuation was not without its dangers. At one point, a patrol of guards nearly discovered one of the groups as they made their way through the cotton fields. Only quick thinking and intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed them to hide among the tall plants until the danger passed. Another group was forced to take a longer route when they encountered unexpected obstacles, but they eventually reached the meeting point safely. Flora Mary and Jedediah discovered the escape when the fire was finally extinguished, and they realized that the blaze had been a deliberate distraction. Their fury was matched only by their fear of the economic losses they would suffer and the example that this successful escape might set for other enslaved people in the region. "Send riders to every plantation within 50 miles, Jedediah ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the fire. "Offer $1,000 for the return of any of them, dead or alive." But the escaped slaves had too much of a head start, and their supporters had planned too well. By dawn, they had reached the safe house indicated by the brass key, where they found food, clean clothes, and detailed maps showing the route to the next station on the Underground Railroad. The safe house was operated by a Quaker family who had been helping escaped slaves for over a decade, risking their own safety and freedom to support the cause of abolition. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the safe house as the sun rose over the Mississippi countryside, holding the brass key that had belonged to her grandmother and feeling the weight of generations of struggle and sacrifice. The key had served its purpose, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of the unbreakable human desire for freedom. The journey to the north would be long and dangerous, filled with obstacles and threats that would test their resolve at every step. They would travel by night and hide by day, always watching for slave hunters and bounty seekers who would stop at nothing to claim the rewards offered for their capture. But for the first time in her life, Evelyn was traveling toward freedom rather than away from it, and that knowledge gave her strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The network that had been partially exposed by the discovery of the key would rebuild and adapt, finding new ways to help others follow the path that Evelyn and her companions had taken. The brass key itself would be passed on to other brave souls who would use it to unlock doors that led away from bondage and toward the promise of a better life. Flora Mary and Jedediah would never recover from the financial and psychological blow of losing so many of their enslaved workers in a single night. The story of the escape would spread throughout the region, inspiring others to seek their own freedom and demonstrating that even the most carefully controlled system of oppression could be challenged and overcome. Years later, when Evelyn had established a new life in the North and was working to help other escaped slaves find their footing in freedom, she would still carry that brass key as a reminder of the night when everything changed. It had unlocked more than just a door. It had unlocked the possibility of a future that her grandmother could only have dreamed of, but had worked tirelessly to make real. The key that had been hidden in her braids had indeed contained something that should never have been there, from Flora Mary's perspective. But from Evelyn's perspective, it had contained exactly what belonged there: hope, courage, and the promise that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable reality for those brave enough to reach for it. Morrison and his team would continue their dangerous work, using the lessons learned from this successful operation to refine their methods and help even more people escape from bondage. The network would grow stronger and more sophisticated, adapting to new challenges and finding innovative ways to outwit those who sought to maintain the system of human slavery. The brass key would become a legend among those who fought for freedom, a symbol of the courage and determination that could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances. And somewhere in the North, in a small house where former slaves had built new lives for themselves, that key would rest in a place of honor, a reminder that freedom was always worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Did you enjoy this thrilling story? Leave your comment below telling us which city you're watching from. We love knowing where our viewers are tuning in from around the world. If this narrative touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our daily stories. We have a new adventure waiting for you every single day, always featuring compelling characters and plot twists that will keep you glued to the screen. Until the next video, and thank you for being part of our community of great story lovers.